Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly discussion series that's hosted by the Chaldean Cultural Center in collaboration with U of M Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. I'm your host, am Nemu, and today our guest is Sophus, Helle. Hello, welcome.
Hello.
So now I you caught my eye because you recently published Enhedwana, the book, and she's like my favorite figure in the whole wide world. And so you're a writer, but also a translator and cultural historian specializing in ancient literature. You translated the Babylonian epic Gilgamesh and the poetry of Enhedwana, the first known author, into English and Danish. So you hold a PhD in comparative literature from Aarhus University and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University. So I have your book here, which lovely cover, by the way.
Yeah, it's a good cover. Yeah.
And this is so exciting because when I learned about Enhedwana, this was, I believe, like around 2005. And I thought, is this correct? Like she's from Mesopotamia. I should know more about her because I was a lot older and just learning about her name and what she's accomplished. And then since then, I have included her in my books in any way I can. We have a museum that I always talk about her, and she's one of my main characters in my feature film because the main character channels Enhedwana to know that she really has a powerful past as an Iraqi woman. And so I have to say, I am so honored, and we are so proud when others honor her in a way by continuing to publish her work and talk about her in different ways. But you're not obviously from Mesopotamia originally. You're not from Iraq or the Middle East. So I'd like to know a little bit about your childhood to see how you ended up writing this beautiful book.
Yeah, sure thing. So no, absolutely. I also find Hinduana to be a great and compelling figure, and I would want more people to know about her and to celebrate her. And I also think it is important that again, the way that Hinduana's legacy is carried through time is through collaboration, through different people. Promoting her in different ways and talking about her in different ways. And that is the way of all literature. One has to work together to carry a text through time. And I think that's one of the beautiful ways of working with literature. So one of the beautiful things about working with literature. As for my childhood, I grew up in Italy. I am from Denmark originally. But yes, I grew up in another culture. And I think that very early aspect, like the very early experience of, moving to one place and then back to Denmark and then so on and so forth, definitely shaped my approach to culture. I think I am interested in culture because I've been experiencing meetings between cultures from a very early age. And of course, the difference between Italian and Danish culture may not be that large compared to other kinds of cultural encounters, but all the same, from an early age, I've been thinking about how to move between languages, between literatures, and so on and so forth. And also, I should say that both of my parents are authors, so that definitely
Oh, okay. You can't leave that part out. That's very important. Um, but particularly your attraction to, I guess, the Babylonian part of history. What initiated that? What was the influence there?
Yeah, and again, I do think that I can't get away from mentioning my mother especially, who trained for a while as an ancient Near Eastern archaeologist and was part of excavations in Jordan. And she herself wrote a book that is set in ancient Mesopotamia, so that is how I first learned about it.
Oh,
But I think
we have to bring your mom one day to interview
really
her. Thank you
she's
for letting us know.
But because in part we traveled in the Middle East when I was a kid, I've always had a fascination with the Middle East, and definitely expressed in the fact that currently both my wife and a large number of my friends are from the Middle East. So I've had an interest in the region from since I was a kid.
Oh, okay. So you're really involved on a personal level as well in that
Could
region.
add that
So there's
either.
several ways. And you know what? That's why this comes across as such a beautiful book. And I think that there's so much heart in what people do. And it does matter when there's all these aspects like the you traveling to the Middle East since you were younger. Did you ever go to Iraq by chance, or you haven't gone there yet?
Unfortunately, I've not yet had the
Not
chance
yet.
to go to Iraq.
Okay. Now, so what at what point did you decide with regards to how did you choose the Epic of Gilgamesh and the poetry of Enheduanna to translate those particular pieces, and what was the experience like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, as you say, a lot of my projects are born of love, love for the Middle East, but also love for the ancient Near Eastern heritage specifically, and for this Babylonian and Sumerian cultures, which for better or worse, I'm just excited by them, and I find them so interesting to think about and work on. And I also do hope that that is carried across in the book, that this is a labor of love. But I also found myself in a position in which what I think I am good at, what I'm best at, is as a translator, but also as bringing these texts that are very well known to my colleagues to a broader audience. I think that is the skill that I can contribute most to. And I chose Enheduanna and Gilgamesh because I think it is those are the ones that have had the most resonance with a broader public. I think there are so many other wonderful works of Babylonian and Sumerian poetry that I hope to present to a larger audience one day. But I started with them in part because those are the ones that I found people were most eager to know about and people were most excited about finding out about. So when I tell people about Gilgamesh and when I tell them about Enheduanna, it really thrills them. And, again, I do think there are so many other wonderful works that also deserve to be better known, but that is why I started with them. And the experience of working with them has been an absolute delight. These are some of my favorite literary works. And so just getting the honor, the privilege to spend time reading them very carefully and thinking about what they're actually saying, that has been a huge blessing.
Yeah, you are right. They do attract a lot of attention, and there's a lot of curiosity about them. So you're right. I find that too when giving a tour, even at the museum, that when I bring up these two particular characters, people are very infatuated by them. So, as a cultural historian specializing in ancient literature, what are some of the most fascinating insights or discoveries you've made about the societies that produce these texts?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think I am a literary historian, so I am always more focused on the structures of literature than necessarily on the societies themselves, though again, they do go together. I think one of the what I really like to find are specific patterns to the ways people tell stories in the ancient Near East. Um, and there are ways of telling stories that recur across many of these texts. So, for example, one that I've always been fascinated about is that both in Gilgamesh and in Hinduana and in a number of other ancient Near Eastern texts, the poems often end up talking about themselves, which is kind of like a very modern thing to do. It's something we think will often happen in postmodern poetry. That oh, the texts are very self-aware. But actually, these texts do it in 4,000 years ago, in which they think about, what is a poem? In the poem itself, and what does a poem do when it goes into the world. And I think there's a lot of very real intelligence in these poems that you can find by spending time with them and seeing how they're built. And so I think often we think about the people of the past as just, we don't even mean it. We don't mean it in a bad way, but I think automatically we think of people in the past as dumber than us. And even if we know that that's not the case, I think we think of modern periods as so complex and so sophisticated, and ancient people are just sort of babbling around. And I don't think that's true at all. Of course, there have always been intelligent people, and they have always done incredibly interesting things with words. And I think finding that is always what I like to do and what I'm most thrilled by doing.
And how do you deal with keeping the integrity of the work through the translation? How do you handle that, especially when I know there's a lot of lines that are omitted? When you come across something, how do you deal with that as well?
Yeah, and I think it's that's the fundamental challenge of the translator. That when you are a translator, you are recreating something, and when you recreate something, it is both going to be entirely new because we should recreate something it's new, but also it's supposed to be in some weird sense the same thing again. That's also what to recreate something means, that you keep things the same and yet you make them entirely new, and keeping that balance is difficult, and it is differently difficult in various texts. So with Gilgamesh, I tried in some respects to mimic the language games of the original in English, so that people got a sense of how, this text is really alive with all sorts of puns and, half rhythms and so on and so forth. But that means that there are other aspects of the text I couldn't recreate. So sometimes, I was distancing myself a little from the original meaning, or perhaps, like, for example, the text has this very archaic tone. It's meant to sound old-fashioned, even in ancient Babylonian. So reading it for a Babylonian would have been a little like reading Shakespeare in English today. It was
Oh,
meant to.
really? Okay. I never thought of it that even, yeah, yeah.
That's not the case in my translation. You will find other translations that.
No, that's not the case because I read some of the poems that you have in here. Well, for Anhedwana, I didn't read the other one. And I like it. Yeah, like it's, it has to relate to the modern audience. That's the whole point of the translation, right?
Exactly. And look, and so I chose to make it fresher than that. But I think part of the beauty of translation when it comes to ancient text, like with a modern book, you can only really translate it once because there are all sorts of issues around copyright. But with an ancient text, you can translate it again and again and again. And so, for example, with Gilgamesh, the things that I might not capture in my translation are beautifully captured in other translations. And I think, again, that goes back to that point about collaboration that I was talking about. We all do various things to help these books across time. And so you sort of have to, oh, this other translation did this, I'm going to do this instead. And that was the case with Gilgamesh. I think within Hidwana, it was a lot more difficult, in part because her poems are more difficult to read, to understand. In part because there are way fewer translations of in Hidwana, so there was less less to say, oh, this person did this, I'm going to do this instead. But yeah, also just because of the form of the poems, it's so much more bound up in language, whereas Gilgamesh is still like a story. It's telling a story, and there are language games, but it's also very much like meant to carry you through the plot, and that's not the case within Hidwana. It's much more compact. So there, I ended up making a translation that was a lot more free, and then people can go to the website inhidwana.org/exaltation. And there they'll find a sort of like line by line translation that really goes into the literal meaning, and where you can really sort of see how the original is built up. Because there, like, finding that middle space was a lot more difficult. And so I decided to have this website solution.
Well, I feel like you've answered some of the questions that I have on here about like some of the misunderstandings and such. And that's one of the reasons I'm going to ask you that I'm going to change questions a little bit. But I want to hear more about her. So I read so much about her, and I think a lot of our audience I take for granted just because I've read so much about her, and I keep being more intrigued, and whatever new information comes up is always amazing. So but our audience, I think, might not be so aware. Here we are, aside from her being the first recorded writer in history, tell us more about her.
Yeah, so absolutely. So in Hidwana, when we say that she's the first author, what we mean by that is that her poems are the first time a literary text is attributed to a person we can identify in the historical record. So we know that she was a real person. Now, there is some debate about whether it's the real historical person who wrote the poems, or whether they were attributed to her later, like a kind of like historical fiction. But I think that's a kind of secondary question, because she's an interesting figure regardless. And the very idea of linking a text to a person, so the idea of authorship, is in a very real sense like developed with these poems.
Well, why is there that debate if she did sign her poetry, and because of the things that she created to kind of seem like she wanted to create a stamp on her name?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best way to answer that question is to say that, and this is not my phrase, I'm stealing it from a colleague, but that Enheduanna had 3 lives, right? And so the first life is the real historical person. The second life is 500 years later, and that's when all the manuscripts of her poems are from. So we don't have manuscripts that are earlier than that. And so again, there's a 500-year gap. Again, it might be that they were transmitted through a form that has now been lost, like oral or copies that just don't exist anymore, or it might have been that they're written in the intervening years. And scholars go on and back and forth and back and forth, and there's no agreement. And the third life is the life right now.
I was just curious about that because I hadn't heard of it before. Okay.
And so her third life is that, like, that, she's living in this very moment. But so let's start with the first life, and that is the actual historical person. And so Enheduanna is the daughter of a person named King Sargon, and King Sargon takes all of these cities that had previously been independent in Sumeria and unites them under one kingdom. And so some say that he creates the first known empire or just the first known territorial state. So huge like upset in ancient history. Things like radically change, and in Hedwana's lifetime would have been one of constant changes to society. I think people would have felt that the world was a lot bigger because Sargon's soldiers would like make their way into faraway lands and bring back all of these precious stones and new textiles, new foodstuffs. Like the world would have felt a lot richer and a lot new, but also very turbulent because like there was a lot of new wealth, but there was also a lot of inequality, and people were also angry. There were a lot of revolts during Enheduanna's times, including against her family. And she was a figure of empire, so she's also a controversial figure in her own time. But she becomes then the high priestess of the city of Ur, which would have been an immensely powerful position. Like she's placed at the head of a temple, and temples are big things. They're big institutions with a lot of wealth under them. And Ur is one of the biggest cities in the state. So, she would have been one of, if not the most powerful woman in her time. And, we know much less than we would like about the actual historical person beyond the literary texts. But there are these glimpses, So one of the glimpses, for example, and I love this story, we know the name of her hairdresser, because her hairdresser was a guy named Ilun Palil, because we have the cylinder seal. So this is like an ancient signature of her hairdresser. He says, my name is Ilun Palil, I am the hairdresser of Hedwana. And so there are all these like things we don't know, and then suddenly you get a flash of knowledge like that. And very importantly, we have a representation of Enheduanna by herself. So it's a disc, a limestone disc, in which she shows herself performing or overseeing a ritual to the goddess Inanna, who was the patron goddess of the empire, of the state. So like her devotion to Inanna is also a political devotion. She's devoted to this goddess who oversaw her family's fortune. But Inanna is also just such a fascinating goddess. She's the goddess of change. She's the goddess of like contradictions, of paradox, of war, of sex, of love, of all the things in life you can't control. So she's a wild goddess. And the poems that are attributed to Enheduanna are about, like the best known of them, the Exaltation and the Hymn, are about Inanna. And especially the hymn really develops in the figure of Inanna in such interesting ways. You really get a very interesting sense of what this goddess is like and what it would mean for the world to be ruled by change and paradox. And it's a very interesting reflection. And I think, if the real Enheduanna did write these poems, then I think you get the sense that she lived through a time of deep political change and thought about that change and what it means to live with change by thinking through the goddess of change, Inanna. So that's one of the reasons I find Enheduanna fascinating.
Yes.
And then,
What happened? Wait, go ahead.
sorry, just to jump a little, just to finish the story. So then 500 years pass and we get these manuscripts. But the reason we get them at that specific time is that Enheduanna's poems are written in the Sumerian language. And Sumerian has died out in the intervening time. And so now it has to sort of be studied in schools. And it becomes a lot like Latin in Europe or Sanskrit in India. That is this language that is dead, but still continues to be important as a language of scholarship and religious rituals. And so people learn Sumerian, and they learn Sumerian in part by writing out Enheduanna's poems. And that is why she survives to this day. And that's her second life, as like in this world of schools 500 years later. So yeah, that's just a brief sketch of Enheduanna's life.
Yeah, and then her disc and her poetry was discovered, was it in 1921?
Yeah, so there is a series of excavations in the city of Ur that bring to light, among others things, this disc. Actually, most of the poems are not found in Ur; they're found in another city called Nippur. But yeah, the disc and some of the poems, some of the manuscripts of the poems, and for example, this hairdresser cylinder seal and the temple in which she would have lived. All of these are found by these excavations in Ur. And again, this is such a, like, I always feel like whenever Enheduanna comes into history is always a really crazy time. So the excavations are happening just as Iraq is coming into being as its own nation state. The Great Iraqi Rebellion is happening literally as they are digging. And I always feel like in Hidwana tends to come with a lot of rebellion and a lot of chaos. So it sort of makes sense that that's when she was excavated.
So, how long did it take you to write this book? By the way, it's available on Amazon, correct? So anybody can purchase it. This is where I got my copy from. Um, how long did it take you to write this, and what was the experience like? Like the things, how much did you know prior to starting? Like, had you done most of your research before, and then just did the translation and more the literary part of it in the book, or just I would love to hear about the process.
No, absolutely. So, I think that's, and you already sort of described it, because I had been doing the research for a long time. Like, I had been doing the research for 10 years. Like, ever since, I say research, but my very first paper at university, when I first could choose what I wanted to write about, I immediately chose Hidwana. And that's, more than 10 years ago at this point. And so gradually, I, was thinking about her, reading the text about her, and she was a major figure in my PhD, my doctoral dissertation. And so I had been, thinking about Hirwana, experimenting with her in my mind, as it were, for a long time. And then the book itself, it was written quite like during a burst of writing during COVID. So very much a COVID project. Actually, both the books were. They were very much COVID
Well,
projects.
authors were treating COVID sometimes as like a retreat, like the doors, can't go out. Perfect. All authors need that, right?
Yeah. And it's telling I haven't written a book since. But yeah, but anyway, yeah, no, and so, and I also wanted to say, just on the process of writing the book, I think, I want to return one more time to this theme of collaboration. That I am so humbled by the people at the press, at Yale University Press, who were so amazing to work with, like truly incredible people there. Who really helped shepherd the book into what it is now, but also just the many colleagues and friends and collaborators, reviewers who have helped me along the way. A book is really like writing a book is a lesson in humility, in indebtedness, and you really find out how much you need other people when you write a book. That's always the experience.
And sometimes the collaboration is sometimes it happens with people that you don't even know. For instance, I know just reading her, anybody who has written about her, I think in your case, this is different because I'm able to reach out and discuss this with you. But in my heart, I always am so grateful
Mm,
and what they've written, and I feel like I don't know that they realize. I mean, you can just kind of give gratitude within
yeah,
yourself, but I feel like, wow, did they know how important this book was for me?
yeah,
Like George Smith, who wrote about the Chaldean account of Genesis.
yeah.
I feel like he found it so important, and it is. But did he realize that it was for others? And by the way, my dog, I don't know if you hear him in the
No,
background. He's
no, no.
never made that much noise. He's being a little bit disruptive right now. But yeah, but so thank you so much for writing this. What are you currently working on now?
Uh, so yeah, no, I also just wanted to say that just briefly before I go on to what I'm working on now, I think um we should definitely celebrate figures like George Smith, but I also think when we're talking about collaborators and gratefulness, like it really is also worth talking about the many amazing Iraqi scholars who often don't get nearly enough credit, and that has been the case since the very beginning of Assyriology. And so much of my thinking about Hidwana has been shaped by talking with or reading work by Iraqi writers. And I think I want to mention Dunya Mikhail, for example, the poet, who has written very interesting things and says very interesting things about Hidwana, or Zainab Bahrani, a scholar at Columbia University who's also from Iraq originally, and who really brings, I think, a very important perspective to these texts. So just when we were talking about collaborators, I wanted to mention.
And thank you for saying that. And you're right. You're right. There are Iraqi-born individuals that really care about that history and that do contribute quite a bit. And sometimes they are not heard as often as they should be. So you're totally right about that.
Yeah, and it makes me very happy that right now there is a process on the way of translating in Hiduana into Arabic, because I think that would be very, very important, And I think like we definitely need a new Arabic translation, or an Arabic translation of the complete poems of in Hiduana. So that is
Well,
something that I can only, again, like now I'm in the role of the collaborator, helping somebody else make that a reality. But that would be something that I think is incredibly important.
yeah, and you know what? Now that you just mentioned that, because there was something on my mind, I always felt that there wasn't enough. She wasn't given the attention that she deserves, and Hadwana in the region that she's from. And it's because of the political, oftentimes the political situation. Iraq is always like involved in some kind of a war, and there's so much tension and things going on there. So that part gets a little bit neglected. But I'm glad that you're saying that, because I know a lot of people also who are in Iraq that love to honor her, and to highlight her work, so that people, not just around the world, but like in Iraq particularly, are aware of her, and give her that kind of credit.
Yep. Yeah, and I think like it's on one level one can say like, oh, she should have been translated earlier into English also. But I feel like that's also, I mean, like sometimes people ask me, oh, why is she not better known? And there are some reasons that that are more problematic, like maybe her gender is part of it. But it's also, you can't underestimate how extremely difficult these poems are. And I was only able to do my translation because a lot of scholars who are more vastly more intelligent than me have spent a lot of time doing very difficult work, and that is work that takes time. There are very, very few people in the world who can read cuneiform, and like especially the Sumerian language just continues to be such a massive puzzle. Like there is no, we're only now just getting a dictionary of Sumerian that people sort of agree about, and even then, like the grammar of Sumerian is still up to debate. So there's a lot of like very basic things that we're still working out, and that will has given us in Hiduana, but will also continues to give us other texts and other wonders.
And most importantly is that there's something being done about it. I think that's the wonderful part, that there are people that are trying to highlight her work, and now you're translating it, so this is all great. And so again, because of the fact that you have done such a wonderful work, and especially with regards to that region, what is your next work? What are you working on next?
So I'm actually taking a step a little out of my usual comfort zone because I was working on a project of comparing Gilgamesh to another ancient epic called Beowulf. And Beowulf takes place in my like native country of Denmark. Like it takes place just outside of Copenhagen. And there's this ancient story of like, fighting monsters and fighting dragons. Incredibly interesting. But there is no readable Danish version of it, like no poetic translation. And even though I don't speak the original language of Old English, I thought I was so entranced by the fact of like bringing Beowulf to a Danish audience. So I'm making a translation of existing translations, so a translation from various English translations into Danish. Which is more, it's more of a poetic project than like more, a scholarly project. But yeah, so yeah, that is what I'm working on now, and that has also been a lot of fun. Very different experience from Enhiduana and Gilgamesh. I honestly think like the world of Enhiduana can be really scary sometimes because it's this, but the world of Beowulf is a lot worse. And yet at the same time, a very beautiful text.
What advice would you give aspiring writers and translators or researchers who are interested in working with ancient literature?
Um, oh, that is a good question. I think first of all, it would be to understand that your translation is always going to be in dialogue with other translations. So that's the great thing, as I said about ancient literature. These texts can be translated many times, and that's a good thing. So every translator can give their perspective, and you don't need to do everything in your translation because a text is most fully translated when it's translated many times. So identify, read the other translations of a text, and find out what is missing from them. What is the part that they haven't done yet? And then do that. Especially if the thing that is missing is something that speaks to you, So that would be my advice.
And any last words, Sophus?
No, I just hope that In Hirwana continues to get more and more fame, because she deserves it. The poems are amazing, her story is amazing, and we can't always tell myth from reality when it comes to In Hirwana. But even if some of it is myth, it's still amazing myth, and the reality that we do know about is incredible. So I think she deserves to be celebrated.
Thank you so much for writing about her, for writing this book, for doing this interview, and connect me to your mom, okay? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Happy Easter to everybody ahead of time. Take
Yeah,
care.
happy to everybody.
Bye bye.